Happy Sunday, everyone. If you're anything like me, you hate the word expert. I have grown to hate this term. It's used all the time. It was used and abused during COVID. The opinions of these individuals were weaponized against everyone else. And this term seems to be generously given out by reporters and people in the media to, people with an opinion who happen to have a few acronyms after their last name or to work in some elevated, government bureaucracy or whatever. This term expert, I think, has the credibility has been ultimately destroyed. And at the end of this musing, I'm going to talk about what that means for us as members of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, because I've been reflecting on how this trend of credibility and destroyed credibility affects leaders of our church. But before we get there, I want to talk a little bit about why this trend has happened. This idea of so-called experts, blasting their opinion to the four quarters of the earth and inevitably being wrong. And that is not a new thing. That is not a COVID thing. Experts are consistently wrong. There was a study in the 80s, for example. So Philip Tetlock, he wrote a book all about this that kind of spread around pretty well because he was in the political science arena and he was using this research to identify whether these so-called experts had views or opinions that were more accurate than the layperson. Do these so-called experts know better than us, see better than us, understand more than us? And so he had all these so-called experts create a bunch of predictions directly within their professional expertise area. So it says, Tetlock insisted that the experts specify which of two outcomes they expected and also assign a probability to their prediction. He did so in a way that confident predictions scored more points when correct, but also lost more points when they were mistaken. With those predictions in hand, he then sat back and waited for the events themselves to play out. 20 years later, he published his results, and what he found was striking. Although the experts performed slightly better than random guessing, they did not perform as well as even a minimally sophisticated statistical model. Even more surprisingly, the experts did slightly better when operating outside their area of expertise than within it. And so ultimately what he found was that the experts were consistently wrong. And that experts who would make these bold claims, would often basically get punished in this evaluation because they were trying to be so, strident or specific in their proclamations and predictions. And when they turned out wrong, a little bit of egg on their face for this research. So this was back in the 80s, and this was just political science. But again, I share this to point out that this is nothing new. For an extremely long time, people have been subjected to the opinions of these so-called experts as pronouncements from on high that, surely are true, when inevitably they typically are not. And not only are they wrong, one of the big problems is that they're never called out on it. We have this circumstance in which experts can go on and make all sorts of wild claims and fearmonger and all this kinds of stuff. And then inevitably, when it doesn't happen, we just kind of look around and move on and we listen to the same people. It's the boy who cried wolf, I just watched last week the documentary on Netflix, Keep Sweet, which is all about it's a mini documentary. It was 4 episodes, all about the FLDS. And it would talk about how Warren Jeffs would make all these, so-called prophetic predictions and, Y2K and they're going to be lifted up, and what was there were a few of them, like these really big, predictions. And then they don't happen. But all the followers are so conditioned where they rationalize and excuse and, it must have been, God's given us more time, or, there's always some reason why that failed prediction doesn't materialize, and that the people keep listening to the same guy over and over again. And so watching that documentary, I thought about this with the experts as well, that they make crap up all the time and they're constantly changing and gaslighting of like, oh, I never, claimed that to begin with. Well, yes, you did, and we have a short memory and it's difficult. I mean, thank heavens for the internet where you can kind of keep receipts nowadays, right? And take screenshots of what these people tweeted, months ago when they're now trying to claim quite the opposite. Here's a paragraph from the New Yorker talking about this exact circumstance where experts aren't being held accountable. When they're wrong, they're rarely held accountable, and they rarely admit it either. They insist that they were just off on timing, or blindsided by an improbable event, or almost right, or wrong, for the right reasons. They have the same repertoire of self-justifications that everyone else has, and are no more inclined than anyone else to revise their beliefs about the way the world works, or ought to work, just because they made a mistake. So we have this problem where all these predictions, it becomes a big problem as we saw during COVID, when the opinions of experts are turned into policy, when they're weaponized, basically, when they're given the force of law, when these, public health fear-mongering, sky is falling type of hypochondriacs, claim all these things that should be done, and we should shut the schools down, and you should all, don't wear a mask. Oh, then wear a mask, then 3 feet, then distance, then 6 feet, then don't have Thanksgiving at home together. Then it's okay if you're in opposite corners and you crack a window, and never mind that that's not good enough in the schools where you need these ventilation systems, right? And these ever-changing opinions are given the force of law. Rather than informing people and letting them make informed decisions to the best of their ability, we basically elevate experts to near demigod status. And when Caesar steps in, when the government, starts to enforce those opinions, these experts exceed their bounds, and we become subject to the opinions of these people who are likely wrong. For COVID, for example, there was this little research project put together with more than 15,000 participants worldwide, trying to see, and this was in 2020, they were trying to see how well people would do in the middle of this pandemic to predict various outcomes, not just, about COVID itself, but also adjacent issues like unemployment, as a result of shutting down the economy, or all these other aspects that were affected in our society. So it says, after this research project, the majority of forecasts were off by at least 20%. And fewer than half of our participants correctly predicted the direction of changes. How did experts compare with the average person? Surprisingly, our experts performed no better than the lay people in our control group, making nearly identical and equally inaccurate predictions for the pandemic's effects on a wide range of phenomena. Even more nuanced measures of expertise, such as an individual's amount of social science training or experience studying the specific phenomenon being predicted, did not show any relationship to accuracy. That's astounding. Perhaps not surprising, but 15,000 participants stacked against all these experts, and none of the experts did any better than lay people guessing about what might happen about a whole host of phenomena and circumstances affected by the pandemic. The experts are just people in fancy suits with letters after their name who have an opinion that, yes, may be more informed, but plenty of informed people are stupid, and a ton of them are wrong all the time. Having letters after your name and having sat at a desk at college for 4 more years and having, written a thesis once upon a time about something unrelated does not confer upon you any more sound analysis than most other people. And that's not to say that we should resist the informed views and, data-driven analysis and others that people can contribute. We should welcome information from all sources. We should seek truth wherever it may be found. But the opinions of experts is not truth. So we saw it, of course, during COVID. That's an easy example where, experts were just wildly off the mark in terms of, spread and the power of the jab to, not lead to so many casualties or to stop spread of the disease, the effectiveness of masks, of shutting down the economy and schools and like all the rest. So that for me is the past 2 years especially has just destroyed the credibility of experts. Anytime I see an article now with the word expert, I just roll my eyes. Because like, what the hell does that even mean? I don't know what the word even means anymore. It's a made up term. It's this term just for a reporter, someone writing an article to boost the strength of their own argument by elevating it's a fallacy of authority, trying to say that what this person is saying must be true because this authority figure said it, right? So that becomes a fallacy of its own. So we saw it certainly during COVID. We've seen it on a whole host of issues. Climate change is an example, right? The polar ice caps are melting, and all decades ago it was the population boom, and we're going to run out of food, and just all these experts have always claimed all these completely wrong things. I should have pulled it up. I think of Paul Krugman, the economist who's written for the New York Times forever, right? He had this prediction that the internet would be no more than like a passing fad. Who would ever order something over a fax machine, and like all these things. So the experts are often wrong. Climate change was an example. Oh, the most recent example I wanted to share is this term online safety expert. Have you seen this popping up recently? I've seen it popping up a whole lot, especially since Elon Musk bought Twitter. All of a sudden the left is going crazy, and one of their safe spaces is no longer safe, and they're howling at how this is endangering minorities and marginalized groups and all the rest, and it's going to literally cause death in the streets and everything. You got Taylor Lorenz, horrible human, at the Washington Post and others claiming that Elon Musk uncensoring all of these past people like Trump and others is going to just create all this harm to people and even death. Here's from the Washington Post just the other day, the title of which is Musk's free speech agenda. They put quotes around that. Free speech agenda dismantles safety work at Twitter, insiders say. And so then they quote this person in the article. Apple and Google need to seriously start exploring booting Twitter off the App Store, said Alejandra Caraballo, clinical instructor at Harvard Law's Cyber Law Clinic. Then the quote continues from this person. What Musk is doing is existentially dangerous for various marginalized communities. It's like opening the gates of hell in terms of the havoc it will cause. People who engaged in direct targeted harassment can come back and engage in doxing, targeted harassment, vicious bullying, calls for violence, celebration of violence. I can't even begin to state how dangerous this will be. Well, that very same individual, Alejandra Caraballo, previously tweeted encouraging attacks on the Supreme Court justices that overturned Roe v. Wade, basically calling for physical violence against these individuals, harassing them, targeting them, never letting them know peace for what they did, right? And so here's this very same individual touted by the Washington Post as this online safety expert, which this article and idea spread to all these major, corporate media institutions, all resting upon the opinions of this so-called online safety expert, when this individual herself, I think it's a woman, Alejandra, was calling for violence in the most hypocritical fashion against her ideological opponents. It's just absolutely hypocritical. And so anyways, that I laughed. Glenn Greenwald, he was pointing out how silly this all was. He was tweeting about it a couple days ago, and latching onto this idea of how silly it is to be an online safety expert. He's like, what does that even mean? Who becomes that? How do you, what diploma do you get for that? What's the certification standard? And so he changed his bio. He's like, I'm going to become an online safety expert. So he added that to his bio. A whole bunch of other people on Twitter have now done the same. I saw one guy that said, his bio was online safety expert, available for interviews by, CNN, MSNBC, and others. And so again, like it's this term that's meaningless because it lacks credibility. What is an expert? Who gets to define what that is when it's really just someone's opinions and ultimately nothing more? Okay, final thing before we get to the churchy stuff, which isn't long. This is going to be a shorter one today. And so this is from an article in the Review Journal that I found very interesting. The biggest error, hang on, let me shut my door. My dog just left. It says the biggest error made by many experts and politicians, though, was not acknowledging that they were capable of making errors. Their announcements were presented as commandments written on stone tablets by the finger of God himself. I think of Fauci, right? I represent science. When they're attacking me, they're attacking science. I represent science. The hubris to say anything like that is just mind-blowing. But this is a very compelling point, because the experts, as we read earlier from the New Yorker, right, that they're not held accountable by others, but they also don't have the humility and the kind of the intellectual humility to acknowledge when they were wrong. No one likes to look like they were wrong, especially experts upon whom people rely and to whom people look for their sophisticated and, intellectual prowess. I don't know, right? And so it's like, I don't know, a mathematician making an error on a formula, or a climatologist or whatever they call weather people making an error totally wrong. Like, especially within your industry, your realm of expertise, to show that you got it wrong so significantly is a lot of egg on your face. And so it's human nature to shy away from admitting that you were wrong. So the experts don't admit that they're wrong. They don't acknowledge that they're capable of making errors. People don't look to their past predictions and see how wrong they were. We just listen to, here's this talking head on CNN or Fox News, or, the government bureaucrat, whoever this is at this press conference, is claiming these things. We got to look at people's track records, right? We need some kind of website or app that can catalog all this. Could you imagine if for every journalist and every government official and every person in power, there's that one website that has the truther meter, and it looks at specific things that are claimed, and it'll have a little description. It was kind of an early version of what today is now called, what do they call it? Fact checking from, what do they call that? The fact checkers. But a more robust version of that, where you could catalog a historical archive showing the prevalence of these experts and being consistently wrong over time. That would be powerful. That, if someone out there is listening, go do that. Okay. All of that being said, talking about experts and destroyed credibility because there's no acknowledgement of error, and there's no accountability. We just move on. Now it's pandemic amnesty, right? Let's just move on. Which is also hypocritical, because the left is mostly the ones driving this pandemic amnesty idea, right? Oh, let's just move on. Mistakes were made. We didn't know any better. And then you got Elon Musk proposing granting amnesty to Twitter accounts, and they're losing their minds. All the lefties are like, no, we can't have that kind of amnesty, but we need amnesty for us so that we're not held accountable. This very much gets almost into secret combination territory, where we talked last week about how this is the laws of wickedness. They're substituting for the laws of God, the laws of wickedness, so that they can do bad things and not be held accountable. And so, I don't know, kind of an interesting corollary there. But as I was reflecting on all this expert stuff, I thought about prophets. How did the two relate? Well, I think prophets are God's experts, but I think there's danger in assuming, just as there's danger in assuming that whatever someone in a lab coat says is true, or if they have acronyms after their last name, therefore it must be more accurate than, Bob commenting on a Facebook group and making a claim about something. Just as we would expect that if there's this official press conference from all these official looking people at this official place, whatever, we assume maybe some legitimacy and some credibility there. I think the same is true of prophets. that there are some assumptions being made that don't always contain evidence to back it up. I think expert is an earned title. And so I think one of the challenges is that it's given out too loosely, that these reporters and others just, call someone an online safety expert. I mean, they even called that Nina Jankowicz lady or whatever that was, wanting to, have all this censorship of the internet and fact checking, these people, the ability to like suppress dissenting views. That whole brouhaha from a couple of months ago, there were all these people claiming that she was an online safety expert. This like lady who just wanted to censor people who had different views. So I think the term expert is bandied about too easily. And I just wonder if there's an element where an aspect of that applies to the term prophet. Because I think prophet is it's an aspirational title, not an actual title. Right? In my mind, a prophet prophesies. And a prophet, I talked about this a few weeks ago, these various kind of roles of being a prophet. But just like, when my son became a deacon, or now he's going to become a teacher, he has different kind of roles in the priesthood, as do I, right? Or, the new bishop gets called, you get these keys, you're given this gift of the Spirit and all these things, right? I think those relate to the potential that you have, not the actual status. In other words, we have to kind of earn our stripes a little bit. We have to grow into the position. We have to rise to the occasion. Many are called, few are chosen. So just because leaders of the church have the title of prophet, seer, and revelator does not necessarily mean that they're prophesying and seeing and revealing. So we sustain them as such, but I think, just as we sustain the guy down the road, in the ward for whatever calling he's called to, I think anyone who's called to a certain position has the potential for growing into that. And so where the term expert has damaged credibility as a result of its misuse, I sometimes I've wondered in the past couple of years, especially with all the COVID stuff, if we have a challenge in the church where the term prophet is the credibility of that term itself is being challenged or threatened or weakened in some way, because as members of the church, we conflate everything that a church leader does with being prophetic. I can't tell you how many people I have seen in the past year or two struggling with this question because they were raised in a church culture in which the prophet could basically do no wrong, and anything the prophet did was directly from God, and raised in an environment to think that every pronouncement and every action and every letter signed over the pulpit and all these things were the unfettered, unencumbered will of God, undiluted from the heavens. And I think the truth is far more nuanced. I think a lot of the people I'm referring to who've been struggling in the past year or two have come to that realization, and it's been a challenge for them because the traditions of their fathers were such that these leaders of the church were elevated, as with Fauci and all the experts, right, to this near demigod status, rather recognizing that all these people, the experts, the public health experts, the online safety experts, expert, and the prophets, the leaders of the church, are all fallible people who make mistakes, who recommend things that might be wrong, who claim, as the case of the First Presidency, that a certain injectable was safe and effective when I think it was neither, right? Who say that, kids of gay couples couldn't get baptized. Oh, but wait a minute, then they can. And then we're going to drop the conference hour, and now we're not. And we're going to, get rid of the Minerva Teichert paintings in the Manti Temple, and now we're not. And the back and the forth, right? Of all these like policy changes. And and decisions, that these are people doing their best and seeking God's guidance, which no doubt in many occasions is given, but that doesn't necessarily mean in all cases it's given. Just as myself in my own capacity as a father, or the callings that I've had in the church, I have a stewardship, and I have a charge, and I have keys, and I have responsibilities. That doesn't mean that God is going to micromanage everything that I'm doing. It doesn't mean that every activity I plan or lesson that I give is directly, inspired by God. I'm trying my best. I seek for that. I want that, but God is not a micromanager. And I don't think he is of any church leader. And so we have to have space for our church leaders to be wrong. We have to recognize that these are, though extremely well-meaning and often inspired, they are still fallible people. And if they do something that we perceive or actually is a mistake or an error or whatever, I think we have to have a church culture that has that wiggle room where we don't have a faith crisis, or we don't question everything all of a sudden, right? Because something was reversed, or we disagree with something, or we think something was factually incorrect. And I think there's a danger here. I think I did a musing some weeks ago about the fact that the church doesn't apologize. I shared in one example where Elder Oaks, President Oaks, said, that the word apologize does not appear anywhere in, our scriptures or in our church vernacular. We look forward, not backward. So I was talking then about this concept of that doesn't really sit well with me to say that, we don't apologize, because I think it also gets to this idea that the church leaders don't do anything wrong. They've never made a mistake. They've never done something erroneous. They've never had to reverse course, even though they have. And I don't think that is a healthy church culture. I don't think that that's consistent with gospel principles. I think apologizing is critical. So just as our experts in society never want to apologize when they do something wrong or when they misstep, why? Because it would reduce in our minds their expert status. In other words, if they bring themselves down to our level where, I can be wrong just as much as you, I'm just like you, a guy with opinions, they come down from that societal pedestal that so many of us place them on. They don't want to. They prefer the adoration. They want to, like Fauci, represent science. The experts want that. They crave that adoration and submission. And so they have this built-in resistance to acknowledging fault and mistakes. Now, I don't ascribe that same nefarious motive to church leaders, but there is a sort of human aspect to all this. Call it an element of the natural man, where we don't like to admit mistakes. We don't like to acknowledge fault. And I think in our church culture, one of the dangers that we have is that I think why we have this church culture, what do I mean by that? This idea that, whatever the prophet says is prophetic, and, we don't acknowledge mistakes or errors, and, we just assume that everything all the time is directly from God. I think the reason why we have this kind of cultural understanding of the role of the prophet is that I think a lot of church leaders worry that if there was this more nuanced view of the prophet's role, if the fallibility were a little bit more, emphasized, I think a lot of church leaders worry that approach would undermine in the people's eyes the role and importance of the prophet. If that nuance was there, if we acknowledge that something might be an opinion or it might be fallible, maybe a mistake was made, I think a lot of church leaders fear that would make it very difficult for church members to know when something is prophetic. But the problem is that if we assume that there are people that believe that, there are church leaders who take that position consciously or subconsciously. The problem with that is that it's exactly wrong. It's exactly opposite. Not acknowledging fault and error and fallibility and humanity and everything else creates more of a problem. when we have this, near demigod, can do no wrong, make no mistakes, everything is directly from God, always and forever, then it leads to things like a faith crisis because something clearly fallible is done, right? Or a policy is reversed, or, statement was made that I think most people agree is, not correct or whatever, right? And then it creates this faith crisis because we've fostered a church culture in which there is no wiggle room, which there is no fallibility, and I think that is worse of a problem. I think it would be more optimal to have a church culture that recognizes that these are amazing individuals, loving, humble, not perfect. I mean, look at church history and all the controversy and all the, infighting and problems, with past leaders of the church. And I don't know that it's never happened in past decades that suddenly everything's just magic and they all get along and don't have their own little fiefdoms of, power and control and, jockeying for power and things. Like, it's human nature. But these people are amazing. They're genuine. They don't have these nefarious motives, yet they're still humans, and they make mistakes, and they take action that is implied to be from God, but maybe necessarily isn't. But God isn't so micromanagerial; they'll step in, and so everyone will just believe it's from God when it's not actually from God. But we just all go along with it anyways because we have this cultural tradition that must be from God. So, in my mind, the role of the prophet, the credibility is damaged. Just like the term expert, I think the role of the prophet, the credibility of it is damaged when we apply it more than we should. Just like the term expert. When we say expert here and expert there and this online safety expert and this public health expert, it dilutes the strength of the predictions and pronouncements that are accurate, that are more aligned with data, that are less politically driven or whatever, right? When you generously assume that everything must be expert opinion, as the data itself shows, as I started out with in this musing, they're mostly wrong. And so then you get people like me who just think that the term is laughable now. Like, anytime someone says expert, I just, again, roll my eyes and think it's ridiculous, authority building, trying to butter someone up so that their views are perceived as more important. Similarly, I think when we too generously talk about prophet this, prophet that, prophet, we dilute the strength of the occasions when something is from God, when the prophet is being prophetic, when the role is being fulfilled. I mean, you remember the story of Joseph Smith. I think he was beating a rug, helping Emma clean or whatever. And someone thought, oh, that's beneath you. Why are you doing this? And, you should have someone else doing that. You're the prophet. And Joseph's reply was, a man is only a prophet when acting as such. What does that mean? Our church culture does not apply that same approach that the founding prophet Joseph himself had. We just assume that everything is prophetic. Every letter written, every article written, every talk given, every statement at any conference that someone caught and Facebooked about and spread all over the internet, we just assume that everything is prophetic. And I think that's dangerous. I think it too generously, it dilutes the strength of the term itself. Not everyone who has a calling rises to the occasion, fulfills the measure of of that calling. I mean, Brigham Young himself would always, resist being called the prophet. Joseph was the prophet. He would say, oh, if I, hopefully have a revelation like Joseph did, by the time I die, I'll be so happy. Like he acknowledged that he was not at the same level. And many of their prophets since, right? Like there has to be room for extremely well-meaning, awesome, hardworking, selfless people to still not be prophetic and seeing and revealing things from time to time. There's nuance here that I don't think we talk about. And we don't like talking about it because it means we have to do the work of figuring out when something is prophetic and when something isn't. We have to seek the spirit of discernment. We have to pray about it. We have to seriously study it. Far easier, far lazier to just assume that everything is from God without question. And so then when we're told that a certain thing that we inject in our bloodstream is safe and effective, we're going to shame all the other members of the church and who aren't wearing a mask or doing, injecting things in their bloodstream for not being righteous because, now we have these outward performances to judge our righteousness by because the prophet said so. Prophet said that, we've been praying for this and it's a godsend and all these things. So I think the leaders of our church are amazing. I love hearing them speak. I love listening to their counsel. I love how hardworking they are. I wouldn't wish for a job like that ever in my life. I say what I say, not with a shred of any malice in my heart or an attempt to undermine their proper authority and their efforts and energies and everything else like that. These are amazing people. Unlike, Fauci and all these self-serving experts that just want, power and status, I don't think that that's true of our church leaders. However, I think our church culture is problematic in how we refer to and understand and think about and treat the prophet and what is or is not from God. Who is that quote? I remember hearing this years ago. I don't remember who said it, but the quote goes something like this, that the Catholic Church, they think their pope is, they say that their pope is infallible, but nobody believes it. And for the Mormons, they say their prophet is infallible, but nobody believes it, right? Like we all know that, oh yeah, he's an imperfect person, but he can do no wrong and everything he says is from God, again, not ascribing any malice, but these are people. These are people with human natures and tendencies and managing an extremely large organization full of people, wanting power and promotions and projects. And one of the most enlightening books I read years ago was David O. McKay and the Rise of Modern Mormonism, where the author had access to all these meeting notes from these meetings, these first presidency and quorum meetings and everything else that usually gets locked away in the vault for no one to see. Again, creating this opaque thing where we don't really know church finances and governance and all these things that's just, kept there and vaulted away. But these notes all ended up outside of the vault and found their way into the hands of the author, who was able to use this as source material and talk about what it was like during the David O. McKay era, behind the scenes, and apostles, pushing for their agendas and again, these are humans, not doing it with malintent. They thought that what they were pushing for was the right thing, and yet there were competing ideas and everything. And I just, I don't want, prophets are so important. The role of the prophet is so important. God talking to people, right? It's just amazing that we live in a time when there are prophets. I think that's awesome. But I don't want the traditions of our fathers, to undermine, to create a church culture that inhibits us from using the prophet the right way, acknowledging God's influence in the right circumstances, and also building our own spiritual capacity to have the discernment to potentially say okay, that's good, counsel, thank you, but I don't actually on this one believe that's from God. I've studied this out, I've pondered, I've prayed, I'm going in this different direction. And to be a good standing, faithful member of the church in moving forward in that direction of potential disagreement with a church leader who everyone else assumes that must be, the unfettered will of God, but someone else has perhaps, cultivated that spirit of discernment and come to a different conclusion. And that we can have room, in the church to some degree for that to happen. I recognize that this complicates things because it becomes a bunch of he said, she said, someone independently saying, well, I don't think that is from God, I'm going to go do this. And, granted, my own decision would be for me and my family. It would not be lobbying for some other church position. The president of the church has the authority to govern church affairs. So I'm not talking about, management and policies and whatever. This is just spiritual things. So anyways, I'll wrap it here. This was just on my mind because this week when Elon Musk said that he would unban all these accounts, and the left has just been freaking out and citing these so-called online safety experts, seeing that term, seeing Glenn Greenwald call himself an online safety expert, which encouraged a whole bunch of other people all over Twitter to do the same thing, to point out the absurdity of the title, reminded me of all the COVID craziness about so-called experts. And then I went and looked into this study from the 80s and all these other examples of how experts are so often wrong, no more accurate in their predictions or understanding than lay people like you and I. And then it just got me thinking about, well, how does this apply to us in the church? And, I think we're fallible and we should apologize, and we should recognize that though well-meaning in our position, we're sometimes wrong. My wife was telling me this morning that there's a guy who used to be in our ward who got split off to the other one when they did the boundary changes. And he plays the organ very well. And every year on Christmas, or at least the past few, he would play like Carol of the Bells, I think it's called. And legit, right? All on the organ, and just this big production, just fun song that uses an organ more than just a fancy piano. And so he's doing the pedals and the multiple layers of keys and everything, right? And so come to find out, in this new ward he's in, I guess he played a hymn kind of fancier on the organ, and the bishop won't let him play anymore. And he can't play Carol of the Bells on Christmas because it's too, what was the term? With too much gusto, I think was the word. And so this particular bishop felt that that was wrong. Oh, silliness. But my point in bringing it up is that here's the church leader who has keys and has authority and has the ability to make that decision. Do I think that decision is from God, that God is like, hey, no, right? And so these people have their charge, they have their authority, their own little domain of keys and control, and that's all well and good because the church has to be organized. But that doesn't mean that their decisions and actions and teachings and recommendations and everything, whether you're a leader in nursery all the way up to the president of the church, it doesn't imply that everything you do is inherently backed by and directly from God. That's the nuance that I think we need to see more in our church culture. It does complicate things because we have to be the arbiters of truth. We need to be close to the Spirit. We need to pray about these things to the extent that we just make these assumptions that everything we hear is from God. It's spiritual laziness. We're not cultivating discernment. We're not seeking confirmation from the Spirit. We're not strengthening our spiritual muscles. We're therefore atrophying. And then when challenges start happening, when you read Helaman 6 and when you read all these things that are going to be happening in our day, if we lack the spiritual strength to be ready, if challenges come, if there are dissensions in the church, if leaders of the church are of a different mind from one another, and there's contention and differing, like whatever happens, right? If we don't have the spiritual strength, then we can be, a casualty. Then we're not going to be prepared. And so I just feel like this is an issue where we need to develop spiritual strength, and we need to understand that there's nuance, and we need to not take the path of least resistance and just have this blanket assumption exempting us from having to pursue an understanding and determine for ourselves what is from God and what is a genuine, well-intentioned recommendation. That's it. That's all I got. Have a great Sunday, everyone.